Good evening, night owls, and welcome to Whisper Crowley. Tonight, I will guide you into a world of darkness, hoping to help you relax and unwind. Perhaps some of you will even drift into a haunting yet soothing sleep. Before we begin, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. And now we begin. Where did everyone go? The question hung in the air of Denver International Airport's East Terminal, as unanswered as my flight status. I checked my watch again, 3 hours delayed and counting. Flight 2317 to Seattle should have departed at 8:45 p.m., but a freak snowstorm had grounded all departures. Now at nearly midnight, the crowd of frustrated passengers had thinned considerably. Too considerably. My name is Michael Chen, a software engineer returning from a conference. Nothing remarkable about me except perhaps an overactive imagination, something my ex-wife frequently pointed out during our divorce. I'd been focused on my laptop, trying to distract myself with work, when I finally looked up and noticed the strange emptiness surrounding me. The terminal still bustled with activity at other gates, but our waiting area had emptied to just a handful of passengers. I counted 7 of us left from what had been a full flight of 143 people. A cold draft tickled the back of my neck. I turned, expecting to see someone passing behind me, but there was only empty space. The overhead lights flickered momentarily, casting strange shadows across the polished floor. "They're rebooking on other flights," a woman nearby offered, noticing my confusion. Her name tag read Eliza Martinez, another conference attendee I'd briefly met. I heard they opened seats on the red-eye to Seattle through Salt Lake City. That made sense. Logical, rational, but something felt off. "All of them?" I asked. Without announcements, Eliza shrugged, returning to her phone. But I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. I approached the gate desk, where a single agent typed furiously at her computer. "Excuse me," I began, "have people been rebooked on different flights?" The agent, her nameplate read Denise, looked up with bloodshot eyes. "Some have, yes. Others simply left to find hotels." She glanced at her screen. "We're still expecting departure at 2 a.m. if the weather clears." I nodded and turned to go when something caught my eye. By the seats where a family of 4 had been sitting just 30 minutes ago, their luggage remained, 4 matching suitcases, abandoned. "What about their bags?" I asked, pointing. Denise frowned. "Sir, those bags. The family that was sitting there, they're gone, but their luggage is still here." Her eyes narrowed slightly. "Security protocol says unattended bags should be reported immediately." "They weren't unattended until recently," I insisted. "The family was there and now they're just gone." Denise picked up her phone, but before dialing, she paused. "That's strange," she murmured. "I don't remember seeing a family leave." A faint whine pierced the air, almost imperceptible, like the sound of electronics under strain. The overhead lights flickered again, longer this time. When they stabilized, I noticed for the first time how the lighting seemed to cast everything in a slightly yellow tinge. "Do you hear that?" I asked. Hear what? The sound was already gone. But as I walked back to my seat, I noticed more abandoned luggage. A designer handbag rested on one chair. A backpack leaned against another. A child-stuffed bear sat alone on a seat, its glassy eyes reflecting the fluorescent lights. I pulled out my phone and pulled up the Denver airport map. Something about the layout had always bothered me. The sprawling size, the strange murals, the rumors of underground facilities. Urban legends, conspiracy theories, the kind of thing I usually dismissed. But now, as I stared at the vast network of tunnels and terminals, I couldn't help but wonder if there was something more to this place. The terminal's PA system crackled to life, but instead of an announcement, there was only static, punctuated by something that sounded almost like words, but not quite. The remaining passengers looked up, confused. I caught Eliza's eye. She wasn't looking at her phone anymore. Her face had gone pale. "That didn't sound right," she whispered. "No, it didn't. Nothing about this felt right." I opened my messenger app to text my sister, thinking I should let someone know about the weird vibe I was getting. But when I tried to send the message, it failed. No signal. Yet the airport Wi-Fi showed full strength. When I looked up again, there were only 5 passengers left in the waiting area. And I hadn't seen anyone leave. I blinked hard, trying to clear my vision. Had I dozed off? The digital clock above the gate showed 12:27 a.m. Only 17 minutes had passed since I last checked, but the waiting area had emptied further. Now there were just 5 of us, myself, Eliza, an elderly man in a business suit, a college-aged guy with headphones, and a woman in a Denver Broncos sweatshirt. The luggage, however, remained. In fact, there seemed to be more abandoned bags than before. "Did you see where the others went?" I asked Eliza, keeping my voice low. Well, she shook her head. "I was checking my email." When I looked up, she left the sentence unfinished, her eyes darting around the terminal. The high-pitched electronic whine returned, slightly louder this time. The overhead lights flickered again, and the air felt charged, like before a thunderstorm. My skin prickled with goose bumps. "I'm going to find another gate agent," I said, standing up. "Something's not right." The elderly businessman looked up. "Young man, airports are always strange at night." "People come and go without their luggage," I challenged. He frowned, noticing the abandoned bags for the first time. "Well, that is unusual." I walked toward the main terminal, passing darkened shops and restaurants. The airport seemed to stretch endlessly, its vaulted white ceiling resembling tent-like structures that had always been part of Denver International's distinctive architecture. Now they looked less like architectural innovation and more like massive webs. The central atrium was deserted except for a janitor mopping the floor near the escalators. His movements were mechanical, repetitive, the same circular motion over and over on the same spot. "Excuse me," I called out. "Where is everyone?" The janitor didn't look up. He continued his circular mopping, humming tunelessly. I approached him, but as I got closer, the humming changed pitch, becoming that same electronic whine I'd heard before. My heart rate quickened. I stopped several feet away. "Hello," I tried again. The janitor slowly raised his head. His face was wrong, not deformed or monstrous, but somehow lacking in detail, as if I was looking at a photograph that had been enlarged too much, losing resolution. His eyes were dark pools, his features blurry. I took an involuntary step backward. The janitor's mouth opened, but instead of words, more of that static-like sound emerged. I turned and ran. When I reached our gate again, I was breathless. "We need to leave," I gasped to the remaining passengers. "Something's happening. We need to get out of this terminal." The college student removed his headphones. "Dude, what are you talking about? There's something wrong with the people here," I said, knowing how crazy I sounded. The janitor I just saw, his face was. "It wasn't right. Maybe you need some sleep," the woman in the Broncos sweatshirt suggested kindly. "We're all tired and stressed," the businessman stood up. "I'm going to find an airport official." "This is ridiculous." He walked toward the gate desk, but Denise was no longer there. In fact, the entire desk was dark, as if it had been closed for hours. "Where did the agent go?" he demanded. Nobody answered. We all just stared at the empty desk. The whining sound began again, louder this time. The lights flickered, and when they stabilized, the businessman was gone. His leather briefcase remained on the floor where he'd been standing just seconds before. "Oh my God," Eliza whispered. "Where did he go?" The college student was on his feet now, headphones dangling around his neck. "This isn't funny, man." "Where is he?" The woman in the Broncos sweatshirt began to cry softly. "I want to go home. I just want to go home." I felt nauseous, my mind racing with impossible explanations. "We need to stay together," I said. "Something's happening in this airport. People are disappearing. That's impossible." The college student snapped, but his voice shook. The terminal PA system crackled again. This time, through the static, I could almost make out words. "Remain in designated areas. Process will be complete. Cooperation is appreciated." My phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number below the terminal. "Find the blue door." I showed it to the others. "I'm not going anywhere," the Broncos woman said firmly. "I'm staying right here until my flight leaves." The college student had pulled out his own phone. "No service," he muttered. "But I just got a text too." He showed us his screen. "They are not people." Eliza's phone chimed next. Her message read, 30 minutes left. We looked at each other, fear etched on every face. "What's happening?" the college student whispered. Before anyone could answer, the lights went out completely. In the darkness, I heard a sound like rushing wind, and the electronic whine grew to a painful pitch. When the emergency lights came on seconds later, the woman in the Broncos sweatshirt was gone. Her half-empty coffee cup tipped over, spilling across the floor. "We have to move," I said, grabbing my backpack. Now the college student nodded, his former skepticism evaporated. Eliza clutched her purse to her chest, her knuckles white. As we hurried toward the escalators, I glanced back at our gate. The abandoned luggage seemed to have multiplied. Dozens of suitcases, backpacks, and personal items scattered across the waiting area. And in the dim emergency lighting, I could have sworn I saw them pulse, just once, as if breathing. The three of us moved quickly through the darkened terminal, guided only by the eerie glow of emergency lights. The vast space felt different now. The high ceilings seemed lower, the corridors narrower. The walls themselves appeared to pulse subtly, as if breathing in rhythm with the abandoned luggage. "We need to find this blue door," I said, showing them the message again. It said below the terminal. "The train to the concourses runs underground," Eliza suggested. Maybe there, the college student who had finally introduced himself as Tyler shook his head. No, man. It's got to be the maintenance areas. My uncle worked construction here when they built this place. He always said there were levels they didn't tell the public about. Under normal circumstances, I would have dismissed such talk as conspiracy nonsense. But nothing about this night was normal. We found a service door near the restrooms. It was marked authorized personnel only, but the electronic lock was dead, presumably from the same power fluctuation that had caused the blackout. Should we? Eliza whispered. A sound from behind us made the decision for us, that same static-filled not quite speech, closer now. We pushed through the door and found ourselves in a utility corridor lit by red emergency lights. The air was different here, colder, with an odd metallic tang that made my tongue feel numb. The walls were concrete, not the finished surfaces of the public areas. Pipes and conduits ran along the ceiling. "Which way?" Tyler asked. I checked my phone, hoping for another message, but the screen showed only no service. The mysterious texter had gone silent. Let's just keep moving down, I decided. The message said below the terminal. We followed the corridor until we reached a stairwell. The stairs descended into darkness beyond the range of the emergency lights. "I don't like this," Eliza murmured. "What if it's a trap? What if staying up there is the trap?" I countered. "People are vanishing, Eliza." Right in front of us, Tyler had pulled out his phone and activated the flashlight. "I'm going down," he said. "You guys can stay if you want." He started down the stairs. After a moment's hesitation, Eliza and I followed. The stairwell seemed to go on forever, spiraling down past what should have been ground level. The air grew colder, the metallic smell stronger. The walls changed from concrete to a strange, smooth material that didn't look like anything I'd seen in construction before. "How deep does this airport go?" Eliza whispered. Finally, we reached the landing. A long corridor stretched before us, lined with doors. None of them were blue. The electronic whine was back, but different here, more rhythmic, almost like a pulse. The sound seemed to come from the walls themselves. "Listen," Tyler said suddenly. "Do you hear that?" Beneath the electronic pulsing was another sound. Human voices. Muffled, distant, but definitely people talking. "Hello," I called out. "Is anyone there?" The voices stopped abruptly. We continued down the corridor, checking each door. Most were locked, and the few that opened revealed only empty storage rooms or electrical panels. "This is useless," Tyler muttered. "We should go back up." "Wait," Eliza said, pointing ahead. "What's that?" At the end of the corridor was a door that looked different from the others. Even in the dim light, I could see its color. Blue. We approached cautiously. Unlike the other doors, this one had no handle, just a flat surface with a small scanner beside it. "Now what?" Tyler asked. I pulled out my phone on instinct, even though it showed no service. To my surprise, the screen lit up with a message, "Place phone on scanner." Without thinking, I did as instructed. The scanner glowed green, and the blue door slid open with a soft hiss. Beyond was a large room filled with screens and equipment. And people, dozens of them, including the vanished passengers from our gate. They turned to stare at us. Their faces were normal, human, not like the blurred features of the janitor upstairs. A woman stepped forward. She wore a lab coat with an ID badge that read Doctor. "Renee Chambers, you found us," she said, sounding surprised. "How did you get past the gatherers? The what?" I asked. "The entities upstairs. We call them gatherers. They're collecting what?" Eliza demanded. "People, Doctor." Chambers shook her head. "Not exactly. It's complicated. You shouldn't be here." None of us should. I looked around the room. The missing passengers sat in chairs or stood in small groups, looking confused but unharmed. The businessman from our gate noticed me and nodded grimly. "What is this place?" Tyler asked, his voice shaking. "A containment facility, Doctor." Chambers replied. Denver International was built over something that was never meant to be disturbed. We've been monitoring it for years, keeping it dormant. But tonight, she gestured to the screens behind her. On them I could see the terminal above, where strange distortions moved through the air, barely visible. Tonight it woke up, the overhead lights flickered, and the electronic whine grew louder. "They're coming, Doctor," Chambers said urgently. "We need to move deeper." "Follow me quickly." She led us through another door at the back of the room. The other passengers followed, some helping the elderly or children. "What about our luggage?" someone asked. "Doctor," Chambers turned, her face grim. "Your luggage isn't luggage anymore." "It's been converted." "Converted into what?" I asked, remembering the pulsing suitcases. "Incubators," she said simply. "Don't ask for what. You don't want to know." The door sealed behind us with a heavy thud. We were now in a tunnel that sloped downward, its walls made of the same strange smooth material. "How much deeper does this go?" Eliza whispered to me. "Deep enough, I hope," I replied. "Deep enough to escape whatever's up there." But as we descended further into the earth beneath Denver International Airport, I couldn't shake the feeling that we weren't escaping anything. We were being herded. The tunnel widened into a vast chamber that took my breath away. The ceiling soared at least 100 feet above us, covered in a network of pulsing blue veins that provided the only illumination. The walls were carved with intricate symbols that seemed to shift when viewed from different angles. The floor was the same smooth material we'd seen in the corridors, but here it was translucent, revealing shadowy shapes moving beneath our feet. "Welcome to Sublevel 13, Doctor," Chambers announced. The heart of what we call the Nexus. The other passengers huddled together, murmuring in fear and confusion. I spotted the family of 4 whose abandoned luggage I'd first noticed. They were alive, holding each other close. "What is this place?" I demanded. "What's happening to the airport, Doctor?" Chambers sighed heavily. This facility was built to contain and study something discovered during the initial excavation for Denver International. The official construction delays and budget overruns in the 90s. "Cover stories for what?" Tyler asked. "A tear in reality," she replied simply. "A thin spot between dimensions." We built the airport as a containment structure with specific geometric properties designed to keep the tier stable. Eliza laughed incredulously. "You expect us to believe that Denver Airport is some kind of interdimensional prison, not a prison, Doctor." Chambers corrected. A door. One that's supposed to stay closed. A technician approached Doctor Chambers and whispered something in her ear. Her face paled. How long? She asked. 20 minutes, maybe less, the technician replied. Doctor. Chambers turned to address all of us. I need everyone to listen carefully. What's happening upstairs is a breach. Entities from the other side are coming through. They're collecting biological material. You mean people, I interrupted. No, she said firmly. If they wanted people, they'd take people. They're taking luggage, clothing, food, anything organic or once organic that's been separated from its owner. They're repurposing it for what? Someone asked. To create vessels. Forms they can inhabit in our reality. The electronic whine that had followed us throughout the airport suddenly intensified. The blue veins in the ceiling pulsed faster. They're getting closer, Doctor. Chambers said. We need to seal this level, and then what? I asked. We just hide down here forever. No, she replied. We've been preparing for this possibility. There's a protocol. She led us to the center of the chamber where a massive circular platform stood. Technicians were rushing around it, connecting cables and typing commands into terminals. This is a quantum displacement device, Doctor. Chambers explained. It can send everyone in this room to a safe location far from here. Send us how? Eliza asked suspiciously. The same way they're coming in, through the tier. But controlled, directed, Tyler stepped forward. This is insane. You're talking about teleporting us. In layman's terms, yes, Doctor. Chambers nodded. It's how we've been evacuating staff. Those text messages you received. Emergency protocol directing key individuals to safety. I remembered the messages on our phones. But why us? Why did we get the messages, Doctor? Chambers looked at me curiously. You weren't supposed to. The system targets specific personnel. Something must have gone wrong with the targeting parameters. A loud banging sound echoed through the chamber. Everyone fell silent. There at the outer doors, a technician called out. Begin the sequence, Doctor. Chambers ordered. Everyone onto the platform now. People rushed to comply, crowding onto the circular platform. I hesitated, watching as the blue veins in the ceiling began to pulse erratically. What aren't you telling us? I asked Doctor. Chambers. She met my gaze steadily. The breach isn't an accident. Someone opened the door deliberately. Who would do that, we don't know. But the timing, the specific nature of the entities being let through, it's targeted. This isn't random, the banging grew louder. A crack appeared in one of the massive doors sealing the chamber. We're out of time, Doctor. Chambers said. Get on the platform. I joined the others, standing between Eliza and Tyler. The platform began to hum, vibrating beneath our feet. Where are you sending us? I called out to Doctor. Chambers, who remained at the control terminal. Somewhere safe, she replied. A secure facility in. Her words were cut off as the door burst open. What came through wasn't human. It wasn't even solid. A shifting mass of shadows and light, with multiple limbs that seemed to exist in several places at once. Its face was a swirling vortex of what looked like static electricity. One of the technicians screamed and ran toward the platform. The entity moved impossibly fast, and the technician simply ceased to exist, his body collapsing into a pile of organic matter that the entity absorbed. "Now, Doctor," Chambers shouted, slamming her hand down on a control. The platform erupted with blue light. The chamber around us began to fade, like a TV losing signal. The last thing I saw was Dr. Chambers facing the entity, holding some kind of device in her hands. She pressed a button and a blinding flash filled the chamber. Then everything went white. The sensation was indescribable, like being pulled apart atom by atom while simultaneously being crushed. There was no up or down, no sense of time or space. Just endless sensation and the terrifying certainty that I was nowhere at all. And then suddenly I was somewhere. We materialized in what appeared to be a military bunker. Concrete walls, fluorescent lighting, armed personnel in unfamiliar uniforms rushing toward us. "Containment breach at Site Denver," one of them was saying into a radio. "Receiving refugees now." Eliza gripped my arm. "Michael," she whispered. "Look," I followed her gaze to a large window on the far wall. Outside was a landscape I didn't recognize, rolling purple hills under a sky with 2 moons. "Where are we?" Tyler asked, his voice barely audible. The soldier nearest us overheard. "You're at Outpost Epsilon," he said matter-of-factly. "Safe zone, Earth-adjacent reality. Earth-adjacent," I repeated numbly. "Yes, sir," the soldier replied. "You've been evacuated from a Class 5 incursion event." Standard protocol. I looked around at the other passengers, all of them as shocked and confused as I felt. The family of 4 stood nearby, the parents trying to comfort their terrified children. "When can we go home?" I asked. The soldier's expression changed just slightly. "That's a question for the command staff, sir. For now, please follow me to processing." As we were led away from the platform, I couldn't help but notice how practiced the soldiers seemed, how prepared. As if this sort of thing happened regularly. "This isn't the first time, is it?" I asked the soldier escorting us. He hesitated before answering. "Denver has been unstable for years. Usually we contain it before civilians notice. This time," he shook his head. "This time was different how the entities got through. They got what they wanted." I thought about the abandoned luggage, pulsing like living things. "Incubators, Doctor. Chambers had called them." "What did they want?" I asked, though I feared I already knew the answer. "A way in," the soldier replied simply. And now they have it. 2 weeks had passed since our arrival at Outpost Epsilon. 2 weeks of debriefings, medical examinations, and psychological evaluations. 2 weeks of watching alien moons rise over purple hills while military personnel spoke in hushed tones about containment failures and breach protocols. We weren't prisoners, exactly. But we weren't free to leave either. Not that there was anywhere to go in this strange, parallel world. The other passengers had settled into a numb routine. The family of 4, the Hendersons, I'd learned, had been given quarters together. Tyler spent most of his time pestering the scientists for information about interdimensional physics. Eliza had become withdrawn, spending hours staring out the windows at the alien landscape. I'd been asking questions, too many questions, according to the military personnel. About Denver, about the entities, about why we were really here. Today, I'd been summoned to meet with someone called the director. The soldier who escorted me wouldn't answer any of my questions about who this person was or what they wanted. I was led to a part of the facility I hadn't seen before, a sleek, modern section that contrasted sharply with the bunker-like aesthetics of the rest of the outpost. The door I was shown through opened onto a spacious office with a panoramic view of the Purple Hills. A woman stood with her back to me, gazing out the window. She turned as I entered, and I gasped. It was Dr. Chambers. You're alive, I said, stunned. I saw you, the entity. What you saw was a containment protocol, she replied calmly. A controlled detonation designed to seal the breach temporarily. I was transported out microseconds before it activated. She gestured for me to sit in one of the chairs facing her desk. I remained standing. You've been asking a lot of questions, Mr. Chen, she said, taking her own seat. That's understandable. But not all questions have answers you're prepared to hear. Try me, I challenged. She studied me for a moment, then nodded. Very well. The incident at Denver International was not an isolated event. It was part of a pattern that's been accelerating for decades. What kind of pattern? Thinning, she said. The boundary between realities is deteriorating. Denver was built on a natural weak point, yes, but such points exist all over our world. We've been monitoring them, containing them. Until recently we were succeeding. What changed? They got smarter, Doctor. Chambers said simply, the entities learned how our containment measures work. They adapted, and they found help. From who? From people. People who believe the entities are divine or alien saviors or the next step in human evolution. People who actively work to bring them through. I remembered what she'd said in the chamber beneath Denver, that someone had opened the door deliberately. A cult, I said. Multiple cults, she corrected. Operating independently but toward the same goal. We've infiltrated several, but they're decentralized, cautious. And what do these entities want, Doctor? Chambers leaned forward. Existence. They come from a reality that's dying, entropy reaching its end state. They want to migrate to ours, like an invasion, like a desperate evacuation, she said. But the process of coming through, it changes them. Corrupts them. They can't exist in our reality in their natural state, so they need vessels. Organic material they can reshape. I thought of the abandoned luggage again. The bags. They were turning them into bodies, crude approximations at first. But yes, they're learning to mimic us. A chill ran down my spine. That janitor I saw, an early attempt, Doctor. Chambers nodded. Not very convincing up close. But they're improving rapidly. I paced the office, trying to process what she was telling me. So what happens now? We just stay here forever. No, she said. We're sending you back. I stopped pacing. What, all of you, the passengers from Flight 2317? You're going back to Earth. Why? After everything you've just told me, Doctor. Chambers stood and walked to a cabinet. She removed a small metallic device shaped like a coin. Because we need you there, she said. The entities are getting through. More breaches are occurring. We need people who know what to look for, who can help us identify incursions early. You want us to be. What? Spies, sentinels, she corrected. Early warning systems. People who know the truth and can alert us when something isn't right. She handed me the coin-like device. This will allow you to contact us if you notice anything unusual. Anything that might indicate their presence. I turned the device over in my hand. And the others. Will you tell them all this? Some, she said. Those we believe can handle it. The rest will be given a cover story, a gas leak at the airport, mass hallucinations, temporary evacuation to a military facility. Their memories of this place will be adjusted. You can do that. We can do many things, mister. Jen, the question is what you will do. I pocketed the device. When do we go back? Tomorrow, she said. A transport is being prepared. You'll be returned to Denver a week after you left in your timeline. The airport has been temporarily closed for structural repairs. When it reopens, everything will appear normal, but it won't be normal, I said. None of this is normal, Doctor. Chambers smiled sadly. Normal is a luxury we can no longer afford, mister. Jen, the world is changing. The boundaries are thinning. All we can do now is prepare. The next day, we gathered on the same platform that had brought us to this strange world. The other passengers seemed excited to be going home, though confusion clouded many faces. I noticed some of them had the same blank, slightly dazed expression, the ones whose memories had been adjusted, I assumed. Tyler stood beside me, fidgeting nervously. They told me everything, he whispered. About the entities, the breaches. They gave me one of these. He flashed a coin-like device identical to mine. Me too, Eliza said, joining us. They said we might need to work together someday. The platform began to hum. The strange purple landscape outside the windows started to fade. Do you think we'll know? I asked them. If we see one of them. The entities in their new bodies, Doctor. Chambers said to look for the signs, Eliza replied. Unusual movements. Electronic interference. That high-pitched whine and faces that don't look quite right, Tyler added. The white light engulfed us again, the sensation of being everywhere and nowhere returning. When reality reassembled itself around us, we were standing in a cordoned-off section of Denver International Airport. Military personnel in hazmat suits moved around us, maintaining the illusion of an environmental cleanup. We were processed quickly, medical checks, paperwork, non-disclosure agreements. The cover story was exactly as Dr. Chambers had described: a gas leak, mass hallucinations, temporary evacuation. Most of the passengers accepted this explanation readily, their altered memories filling in the gaps. As we prepared to leave, I looked at the massive white tinted ceiling of Denver International. It no longer seemed like an architectural marvel. Now I saw it for what it was, a containment structure, a lid on something ancient and hungry. "What do we do now?" Eliza asked as we collected our replacement luggage, new bags provided by the airline as compensation for our inconvenience. "We watch," I said. Wait. "And we look for the signs," Tyler nodded grimly. "They're coming through. Dr. Chambers said Denver wasn't the only breach." "There are others." I clutched the coin-like device in my pocket. "Then we'll be ready." As we walked toward the exit, I noticed a janitor mopping the floor near the escalators. His movements were perfectly normal, his face unremarkable. He nodded politely as we passed. But just for a moment, I thought I heard that high-pitched electronic whine. I kept walking, eyes forward, the coin burning in my pocket like a promise or a warning. The door was open now, and what had come through was only the beginning. I hope you enjoyed the first story. If you did, don't forget to leave a like, but if I didn't do my job well, feel free to give it a thumbs down. Either way, drop a comment and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is for you. Now, let's continue. Have you ever noticed how some sounds are so quiet they hurt? The Texas summer heat had finally broken, leaving behind the kind of crisp October evening that made small-town life seem worthwhile. I had moved to Stillwater just 3 months ago, taking over as the town librarian after Mrs. Holloway's unexpected passing. The locals were still warming up to me, the outsider from Austin with too many tattoos and not enough church attendance to satisfy the town elders. My rented cottage sat on the outskirts of town, just down the hill from St. Matthias Church, a looming Victorian structure whose bell tower pierced the night sky like an accusatory finger. The church had stood there since the 1880s, its weathered limestone facade telling stories of dust storms, oil booms, and the slow march of prairie time. I was shelving books in my living room when the clock on my mantel showed 11:55. Something made me pause, a pressure change in the air, perhaps. The kind that precedes a storm. But the weather report had promised clear skies. I moved to the window, pulling back the curtain to gaze up at the church on the hill. Moonlight bathed the bell tower in an eerie silver glow. From my vantage point, I could just make out the massive bronze bell within. According to town lore, it had been cast in Europe and shipped across the Atlantic at great expense. The voice of Stillwater, the elderly patrons at the library called it. Yet in all my time here, I had never heard it ring. As the hands of my clock aligned at midnight, something odd happened. The massive bell began to swing. Back and forth, back and forth. Its movement was unmistakable against the night sky. I waited for the resonant toll to roll down the hillside and wash over my cottage. Nothing came. Just the soft chirp of crickets and the distant hum of the highway. The bell swung silently, its massive weight cutting through the air without disturbing it. Perplexed, I slipped on my shoes and stepped onto the porch for a better look. The night air felt unusually dense around me, pressing against my skin like an invisible fluid. As I watched the silent pendulum of the bell, a dull ache began to bloom behind my ears. At first, I dismissed it as the beginning of a headache. I'd been squinting at library inventory sheets all day. But it grew steadily, transforming from discomfort to something more intrusive. It wasn't pain exactly, more like pressure, as if something was trying to push its way into my skull through my ear canals. I took a step back inside, and oddly, the sensation lessened. Forward again, and the pressure returned. 3 more soundless swings of the distant bell, 3 more waves of that strange ear pressure washing over me. My phone buzzed in my pocket, a text message from my neighbor Ellie, an insomniac painter who lived in the cottage across the way. "Do you feel that?" Her message read. "The bell." I typed back. "It's wrong. Something about it is wrong." I looked back up at the hill. The bell had stopped its swinging now, hanging motionless in its tower. The pressure behind my ears faded, leaving behind a phantom echo of discomfort. That night I dreamed of standing in the bell tower. In my dream I could hear what my waking ears could not, a sound so low and vast it seemed to originate from somewhere beneath reality itself. A sound that made my bones vibrate and my teeth ache. A sound that felt ancient and patient and hungry. I woke at dawn with dried blood crusted around my ears. "Just a nosebleed," I muttered to myself, though I knew the blood hadn't come from my nose. I scrubbed away the evidence and dressed for work, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen last night was just a trick of moonlight and shadow. The bell hadn't really moved. The pressure in my ears had been the beginning of a sinus infection. Ellie's text had been about something else entirely. But as I walked to my car, I found myself unable to look up at the church on the hill. Something whispered at the edges of my consciousness that if I did, I might see the bell watching me somehow, hanging in its tower like a massive, lidless eye. "Don't be ridiculous," I told myself as I started the engine. But I took the long way to the library that morning, driving around the far side of town rather than passing beneath the shadow of St. Matthias. In the library's back office, I found an old folder labeled Town History, St. Matthias, and began to read. Something told me I needed to understand what hung in that bell tower, and why, when it moved, it chose to do so in silence. The town library's archives were surprisingly extensive for a community of Stillwater's size. The folder on St. Matthias Church contained newspaper clippings, correspondence, and fragile photographs dating back to the church's construction in 1883. I spread the materials across my desk, ignoring the occasional patron who needed assistance. Looking into old St. Matt's, are you? I startled at the voice. Thomas Hargrove, the octogenarian who came in every Tuesday to read outdated agricultural journals, peered at me from across the desk. His eyes, cloudy with cataracts but still sharp with intelligence, scanned the documents before me. "Just curious about the church," I said, keeping my tone casual. "Especially the bell tower." Something flickered across Thomas's weathered face, a shadow of recognition, perhaps even fear. He glanced around as if to ensure we were alone among the stacks. "That bell," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "was never meant to be here." He sat down heavily in the chair opposite me, his arthritic hands trembling slightly as he leaned forward. "The original bell cracked during a storm in 1927. Lightning hit the tower. The replacement came from a monastery in Eastern Europe, somewhere in the Carpathian Mountains. The shipment arrived 2 days before the spring equinox in 1928. Thomas paused, his rheumy eyes growing distant with memory. "My father helped install it. Said it took 16 men to lift it into place. And that's when the first incident Happened incident, I prompted when he fell silent. 2 men fell from the tower that day. Both claimed afterward they'd heard a sound so terrible it made them lose their balance. But nobody else heard anything at all. Thomas tapped a yellowed news clipping on my desk. It's not in the official account, of course. Townsfolk didn't talk about such things back then. I scanned the article. It mentioned the installation of the new bell, but described the workers' falls as unfortunate accidents with no reference to any sound. The church elders decided to consecrate the bell before using it, Thomas continued. But that night before the ceremony, it rang by itself. At midnight, everyone in town saw it swinging, but no one heard it toll. His voice quavered. Except those who stood too close. My skin prickled. What did they hear? Nothing they could describe. My father said it wasn't a sound you hear with your ears, but something you feel in the hollow spaces of your body. Like your insides were being rearranged. Thomas rubbed his sternum unconsciously. 7 people who lived in the houses nearest the church fell ill that night. Bleeding from their ears. Disoriented. Talking nonsense about the spaces between sounds and voices from the other side of silence. I thought of the dried blood around my ears that morning. The minister wanted the bell removed, but before they could act, a fire destroyed the church records, including documentation of where the bell had come from. Thomas shook his head slowly. Convenient, that fire. Almost as if something wanted the bell to stay right where it was. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a faded photograph, sliding it across the desk to me. It showed the bell being hoisted into the tower, an enormous bronze behemoth with symbols etched around its circumference. My father took this picture. Look closely at those markings. I squinted at the image. The symbols weren't decorative flourishes as I'd expected. They formed an intricate pattern of angular writing, nothing like the Latin inscriptions common on church bells. Nobody in town could identify the script, Thomas said. The university in Austin sent a linguist, but he left town suddenly after spending one night studying the bell. Never published his findings. I reached for my phone, intending to take a picture of the photograph, but Thomas's hand shot out with surprising speed, stopping me. Don't, he said sharply. Some things shouldn't be reproduced. He took the photograph back, returning it to his wallet. The church elders decided the best course was to never ring the bell at all. They disconnected the pull ropes and spread the story that the bell was merely decorative. Eventually, people accepted this. Thomas's expression darkened. But every so often, always at midnight, always during the dark of the moon, the bell moves on its own. Like last night, I murmured. Thomas's eyes widened slightly. You saw it, I nodded, then hesitated before adding, I felt something too. A pressure in my ears. You live too close, he said, his voice urgent now. The effect is strongest within a certain radius of the tower. People who have lived in its shadow too long. Change how? Thomas stood up abruptly, gathering his cane. I've said too much already. If you're smart, you'll find someplace else to live before the next dark moon. He turned to leave, then paused. One more thing. If you insist on staying in that cottage, line your windows with salt. And whatever you do, if you hear someone knocking at midnight, no matter who they claim to be, don't answer your door. With that cryptic warning, he shuffled away between the bookshelves, leaving me with more questions than answers and a growing sense of unease. That afternoon, as I drove home, dark clouds gathered suddenly overhead. I parked in my driveway and looked up at the church on the hill. In the gray storm light, the bell tower seemed to lean slightly, as if bending toward my cottage. A trick of perspective, surely. Thunder rolled across the sky as I hurried inside, the first fat raindrops striking my shoulders. Once inside, I found myself moving methodically through the house, checking window latches and door locks. In the kitchen cabinet, I found a container of table salt. I hesitated, feeling foolish, then proceeded to line each windowsill with a thin white trail. The storm intensified, rain lashing against the windows as lightning split the darkening sky. With each thunderclap, I flinched, half expecting to see the distant bell begin to swing in its tower. But the bell remained still. It was during a brief lull in the storm that I noticed something odd about the rain patterns on my front window. The droplets seemed to be avoiding the salt line, creating a distinct dry boundary that defied the laws of physics. As I leaned closer to examine this impossibility, the room plunged into darkness as the power failed. In the sudden silence that followed, I heard it, a soft, deliberate knocking at my front door. 3 knocks. Deliberate. Evenly spaced. I stood frozen in my darkened living room, hoping I'd imagined the sound. The storm had momentarily abated, leaving an unnatural quiet broken only by the gentle patter of lingering raindrops falling from the eaves. Then it came again. Knock, knock, knock. Hello, a voice called from the other side. Anyone home? My car broke down in the storm. The voice sounded ordinary, male, middle-aged, with the slight drawl common to this part of Texas. Reasonable. Normal. But Thomas's warning echoed in my mind. No matter who they claim to be, don't answer your door. I saw your lights earlier, the voice continued. I just need to use a phone to call for help. I remained silent, my heart hammering against my ribs. I had no flashlight at hand, and my phone lay charging in the kitchen. The darkness felt increasingly oppressive, almost viscous around me. Please, the voice said, a note of desperation creeping in. It's really coming down out here. Despite my misgivings, I felt a twinge of guilt. What if this really was just a stranded motorist? I took a hesitant step toward the door. Thunder crashed directly overhead, so loud it made the windows rattle. The brief flash of lightning illuminated the front door, specifically the narrow gap beneath it. No shadow interrupted the thin line of storm light visible under the door. No feet stood on my porch. I stumbled backward, bile rising in my throat. I know you're in there, the voice said, all pretense of normality evaporating. It dropped an octave, developing an unnatural resonance that made my teeth ache. I can feel you listening, the knocking resumed, no longer polite. The impact shook the door in its frame, each blow making the wood bulge inward as if struck by something impossibly heavy. Boom, boom, boom. The salt line at my front window began to glow faintly, casting a weak bluish light across the room. Outside, through the rain-streaked glass, I could see nothing but darkness. My phone. I needed to call someone. Abandoning stealth, I rushed to the kitchen, fumbling for my device. The screen came to life, illuminating my shaking hands. But before I could dial, the screen flickered and displayed a text message from an unknown number. Look up. Against every instinct of self-preservation, I raised my eyes to the kitchen window. A face stared back at me, or rather, something that approximated a face. In the dim light of my phone's screen, I could make out features that seemed to shift and reposition themselves, as if the concept of a human countenance was being poorly translated into reality. Only the eyes remained constant, black, depthless, and utterly devoid of anything I recognized as human consciousness. A scream built in my throat, but emerged only as a strangled whimper. I dropped my phone and scrambled away from the window, knocking over a chair in my panic. The pounding at the front door stopped abruptly. In the following silence, I heard something new, the slow, deliberate sound of something moving around the perimeter of my cottage, testing each window and door. The salt lines glowed brighter with each attempted intrusion, pulsing like a silent alarm system. Then came a sound from above, a scraping, scuttling noise across my roof. Something heavy dragged itself toward the chimney. I retreated to the bathroom, the only room without windows, locking the flimsy door behind me. In the pitch darkness, I sat on the edge of the tub, straining to hear over the thunder of my own pulse in my ears. A vibration began to build in the air around me, not a sound exactly, but a pressure wave that made the ceramic tiles beneath my feet tremble. It intensified until my skull felt like it might crack from the inside out. Warm liquid trickled from my ears, spattering onto the tile floor. Through the haze of pain, a terrible certainty formed in my mind. This was what the bell sounded like to those who could hear it. Not silence, but a frequency so profound it existed at the threshold between sound and something else, something our human senses weren't designed to perceive. The bathroom mirror shattered spontaneously, shards tinkling into the sink. The vibration reached an unbearable crescendo, and I clapped my hands over my bleeding ears, screaming into the void of pressure surrounding me. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, it stopped. In the silence that followed, I heard the distant church bell begin to swing. Midnight had arrived. Though I couldn't see it from my windowless refuge, I knew it was moving, cutting silently through the night air, visible to anyone watching but audible only as this bone-crushing pressure to those caught within its influence. The scuttling on my roof ceased. Whatever had been attempting to enter my home retreated, called back by the motion of the bell. I remained frozen in place, afraid to move until I was certain the danger had passed. Hours later, or perhaps only minutes, the power returned, lights flickering on throughout the cottage. Cautiously I emerged from the bathroom, my legs unsteady beneath me. Blood had dried on my neck and soaked into my shirt collar. The cottage appeared undisturbed except for the broken mirror and the chair I'd knocked over in the kitchen. Outside, the storm had passed. Moonlight shone through gaps in the dissipating clouds. I approached the front window gingerly, peering out toward the church on the hill. The bell hung motionless in its tower once more. On the ground around my cottage, a peculiar pattern had been pressed into the wet earth, a series of indentations too geometric to be natural, too alien to be human footprints. They circled the building completely before lighting away, up the hill toward St. Matthias. I spent the remainder of the night huddled on my couch, lights blazing in every room, jumping at each creak and settling sound of the old cottage. When dawn finally broke, I called in sick to work and drove straight to Ellie's cottage across the way. Her door was ajar when I arrived. Inside, the furniture had been overturned, pictures knocked from walls. Of Ellie herself there was no sign, just a trail of salt scattered across her floor, the line broken in several places, and a dark stain soaking into the floorboards beneath her easel. On the easel stood her final painting, a meticulously rendered image of St. Matthias's bell tower, the bell captured mid-swing. Splashed across the canvas in what looked disturbingly like blood were three words. ITC's USI reported Ellie's disappearance to the local police, who seemed oddly unperturbed. Sheriff Daniels took minimal notes, his expression neutral as I described the state of her cottage. Probably just took off, he said, snapping his notebook closed. Artists are flighty types. What about the blood? I demanded, my voice rising with frustration. The broken furniture. Sheriff Daniels surveyed the room with practiced indifference. Could be paint. As for the mess, well, creative types live chaotic lives, don't they? He refused to consider the possibility of foul play, and when I mentioned the church bell and the midnight visitor, his demeanor shifted from dismissive to hostile. Don't go spreading stories about St. Matthias, he warned, his tone suddenly cold. This town values its peace and quiet. As he spoke those words, peace and quiet, I noticed something I hadn't before, a thin line of dried blood at the sheriff's ear, hastily wiped away but still visible if you knew to look for it. I left Ellie's cottage no closer to answers, but increasingly certain of one thing. Whatever force resided in that bell tower held sway over more than just the night air. It had worked its influence into the fabric of Stillwater itself. With nowhere else to turn, I drove to the church. In daylight, St. Matthias appeared perfectly ordinary, a well-maintained Victorian structure with stained glass windows and a neat graveyard extending behind it. The bell tower rose from the northeast corner, sunlight glinting off the bronze behemoth housed within. The church door creaked as I entered. The sanctuary was empty except for an elderly man polishing the wooden pews, the caretaker, I presumed. He looked up as I approached, his weathered face splitting into a welcoming smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. Welcome to St. Matthias, he said. Don't believe I've seen you at Sunday service. I'm not here for worship, I replied, forcing myself to maintain eye contact. I'm interested in the bell tower. His smile remained fixed, but something shuddered behind his eyes. The tower's not open to visitors. Structural concerns, you understand. I don't need to go up. I just want information about the bell itself. Its history. The caretaker's cloth moved rhythmically over the wood, back and forth, back and forth. Nothing much to tell. Decorative piece, that's all. Never been rung in living memory. Then why does it move at midnight? The question burst from me before I could reconsider. His hand stilled. Excuse me, I've seen it swing. Others have too. But it makes no sound, at least not when you can hear with your ears. The caretaker straightened slowly, his expression hardening. I think you should leave. What happened to the linguist from Austin? The one who came to study the inscriptions. A muscle twitched in the old man's jaw. I don't know what you're talking about. People are being affected by it. My neighbor is missing. I was attacked last night by something live, he repeated, his voice dropping to a near whisper. For your own sake, I stood my ground. Not until I get some answers. The caretaker's eyes darted toward the entrance behind me. Before I could turn, something heavy struck the back of my head. My vision exploded into stars, then darkness. I awoke in my own bed, sunlight streaming through the windows. For a disorienting moment, I wondered if everything, Ellie's disappearance, my confrontation at the church, had been a vivid nightmare. Then the throbbing pain at the base of my skull confirmed otherwise. Rolling over, I discovered a folded note on my nightstand. Inside, written in shaky cursive, the bell must be fed. It has been this way since 1928. Once per generation is usually enough. Midnight, dark moon. Don't interfere or you'll be next. A friend I crumpled the note in my fist, rage temporarily overcoming fear. They had taken Ellie. The town, or at least certain elements within it, were complicit in whatever malevolence emanated from that tower. Checking my phone, I discovered I'd been unconscious for nearly 24 hours. It was now late afternoon, the sun already beginning its descent. On impulse, I searched for Carpathian monastery bell and silent bell phenomena. The results were sparse but chilling, folktales of bells cast with cursed metal, designed not to call the faithful to worship, but to open doorways to places beyond human comprehension. One account from 1760s Hungary described a bell that moves in silence yet calls with voices only the marked can hear. Those who answered its call were never seen again. The monastery itself had been destroyed during a peasant uprising, its arcane practices condemned by the church. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I felt the pressure building again, that subtle change in the air that preceded the bell's movement. My ears began to ache in anticipation. I couldn't stay in the cottage another night. Gathering essential belongings into a backpack, I headed for my car, intent on driving as far from Stillwater as possible before midnight. The engine refused to turn over. I tried again and again, increasingly frantic as darkness gathered. Finally, I popped the hood and found the distributor cap missing, neatly removed by someone who knew exactly how to disable a vehicle. Looking up from the sabotaged engine, I saw lights flickering on in houses across town. Doors closed, curtains drawn. Stillwater was battening down for the night, leaving me alone on the darkening street. With no other options, I began walking toward the highway, keeping my eyes fixed on the road ahead, refusing to look up at the church looming over the town. If I could reach the truck stop at the junction, perhaps I could find help, or at least sanctuary until dawn. I had barely reached the edge of town when I heard footsteps behind me, many footsteps, moving in perfect unison. Risking a glance over my shoulder, I saw them, a procession of townsfolk walking up the hill toward St. Matthias. Their movements were stiff, mechanical. At the head of the procession was Sheriff Daniels, and beside him, supported between two blank-faced deputies, was Thomas Hargrove, his elderly face contorted with terror. They were taking him to the bell. I ducked behind a hedge, watching in horror as the procession passed. Every member moved with the same unnatural gait, their faces expressionless except for Thomas, who struggled weakly against his captors. A terrible understanding dawned. The note had mentioned once per generation. Thomas had been too free with information, too willing to share the town's dark secret with an outsider. Now he would pay the price. I should have kept walking toward the highway. I should have saved myself. Instead, I found myself following the procession at a distance, driven by some mixture of horrified fascination and the irrational belief that I might somehow help the old man. The church doors stood open, welcoming the silent parade of townsfolk. I circled around to the cemetery, searching for another way in. A small side door, likely used by the caretaker, was unlocked. I slipped inside, finding myself in a narrow corridor that led toward the sanctuary. Voices drifted down the hallway, a low, rhythmic chanting in a language I didn't recognize. Peering through a crack in the doorway, I beheld a scene from some medieval nightmare. The townsfolk had formed a circle beneath the bell tower's interior opening. Thomas knelt at the center, head bowed. Above them all hung the massive bell, visible through the tower shaft, poised like an executioner's blade. Standing before Thomas was a figure in ceremonial robes, the minister, I presumed, though his face was concealed by a hood. In his hands he held an ancient book, its pages yellowed and brittle. "The bell requires sustenance," the minister intoned, his voice carrying clearly to my hiding place. "The voice of Stillwater must be fed if it is to continue its protection. I leaned closer, straining to hear. For nearly a century it has stood guard at the threshold, keeping them at bay. The spaces between worlds grow thin at the dark of the moon. The bell maintains the boundary. Without its vigilance, they would pour through." The minister raised his hands toward the bell. "But such power demands sacrifice. A willing sacrifice freely given." Thomas's voice, weak but defiant. "I never agreed to this. You spoke of the bell to an outsider. You broke our covenant of silence. By our laws that constitutes consent." The chanting intensified. The air in the church grew heavy, charged with that same pressure I'd felt during the bell's midnight movements. My ears began to throb painfully. Above them, imperceptible to anyone not watching for it, the massive bell began to stir in its cradle. What happened next unfolded with nightmarish clarity. As the bell's swing gained momentum, a distortion appeared in the air beneath it, a shimmering, vertical tear in reality itself. Through this impossible aperture came a sound that bypassed my ears entirely, resonating directly within my skull. Not a tone or a note, but something more primal, the auditory equivalent of absolute darkness. The townsfolk tilted their heads upward in unison, their expressions rapturous. Blood began to trickle from their ears, running down their necks in rivulets that stained their collars crimson. Thomas screamed as invisible forces lifted him from the floor, drawing him upward toward the swinging bell and the rift beneath it. His body contorted unnaturally, as if being examined by curious, unseen hands. I must have made some sound of horror, for suddenly all heads turned in my direction. Dozens of blood-streaked faces stared at me with empty eyes, their mouths opening in perfect synchronicity. "Join us," they said in unison, their voices harmonizing with that terrible pressure knot sound emanating from the bell. Hear the voice of Stillwater, I ran. Behind me, the church erupted into chaos as some of the townsfolk broke from their trance to pursue me. I burst through the side door into the cemetery, my only thought to put as much distance as possible between myself and that unholy bell. But as I reached the cemetery gate, I realized with sinking horror that I was too late. Midnight had arrived, and all across Stillwater, in perfect silence, the boundaries between worlds had begun to thin. The night air rippled around me as I fled through the cemetery, reality itself seeming to warp and distort with each silent toll of the bell. Tombstones stretched and contracted in my peripheral vision, their shadows lengthening impossibly across the ground. Behind me, the voices of my pursuers distorted into something inhuman, a chorus of sounds that oscillated between whispers and screams without ever passing through the range of normal human speech. I risked a glance back and immediately wished I hadn't. The townsfolk no longer moved like people. Their limbs bent at impossible angles, their gaits jerky and insectal as they scrambled over graves and monuments. I reached the main road and ran downhill, away from the church, away from the silent pealing that was tearing holes in the fabric of existence. Each invisible wave of the bell's influence washed over me, bringing new horrors in its wake. The street lamps flickered and died as I passed beneath them. Households that had prudently locked themselves inside now became active participants in the night's malevolence, doors flying open of their own accord, disgorging residents who moved with that same unnatural coordination, all of them bleeding from the ears, all of them calling my name in perfect unison. "The bell sees you," they chanted. "The bell knows you. The bell wants you." A car screeched around the corner ahead, Sheriff Daniel's patrol vehicle, headlights cutting through the darkness. I dove into an alleyway between houses, scraping my palms raw on gravel as I scrambled for cover. The pressure in my head built to an excruciating level. My vision blurred as blood trickled warmly down my neck. I could feel the bell's influence seeping into my consciousness, trying to reorganize my thoughts into patterns more pleasing to whatever entity resided in that bronze monstrosity. Images flashed through my mind, a monastery in ruins, monks with their throats cut, molten metal mixed with blood, ancient symbols carved by hands that weren't entirely human. I saw the linguist from Austin transcribing the bell's inscriptions, his eyes widening in comprehension moments before he clawed them from their sockets. I saw Ellie suspended in a space that wasn't a space, her body contorted as curious appendages explored her form. And I understood what the bell truly was, not a gateway or a threshold, but a two-way mirror. Something ancient had been watching our world through that bronze eye for centuries, learning, waiting. The sacrifices weren't to keep entities out, they were invitations to come in. Thomas had been right about one thing: the bell hadn't been meant for scent. Matthias. It had been contained within the monastery, kept dormant by constant prayer and ritual. When that containment failed, the bell had orchestrated its own journey across an ocean to this isolated Texas town, where it could operate with minimal interference. The vibrations intensified. I felt my consciousness beginning to fragment, pieces of myself being pulled toward the silent tolling on the hill. If I surrendered to it, the pressure would stop. The pain would end. I would become one with the voice of still water. My phone buzzed in my pocket, impossible, given the electromagnetic disturbances rippling through town. Yet when I pulled it out, the screen glowed with a message from an unknown number. The bell lies. Break its voice. Through my delirium, a moment of clarity. The bell had no voice, that was its power and its deception. It created the illusion of silence while actually generating a frequency beyond human perception, a vibration that allowed it to reshape reality around itself. But if it could be forced to truly ring, to produce an actual audible tone, perhaps its power would be broken. I dragged myself to my feet, fighting against the pressure threatening to burst my skull. Instead of running away from the church, I began moving toward it, using the shadows and alleys to avoid the searching townsfolk. Each step required monumental effort, like wading through invisible molasses. The church rose before me, the bell tower now surrounded by a subtle distortion, like heat waves on summer asphalt. The bronze bell swung with increasing vigor, each arc tearing wider rifts in the air around it. I needed to reach the tower, but the main entrance would be guarded by the congregation, still engaged in their dark ritual. I recalled the cemetery's side entrance, but that too would likely be watched now. Then I remembered something from the town history folder. The church had been renovated in the 1960s, with part of the original foundation repurposed as a cellar. If I could find the cellar entrance, perhaps I could access the bell tower from within. Moving around the perimeter of the church grounds, I located a rusted bulkhead door partially hidden by overgrown shrubbery. It groaned in protest as I pulled it open, revealing stone steps descending into darkness. The subterranean air felt thick with age and decay as I made my way down. My phone's flashlight revealed a labyrinth of narrow corridors beneath the church, original foundation walls and newer support structures creating a claustrophobic maze. Above me, I could hear the congregation's chanting intensifying, punctuated by sounds that might once have been human screams before they were twisted into something else. The bell's pressure was omnipresent down here, making my movements sluggish and my thoughts disjointed. I found a narrow spiral staircase built into one of the original stone walls, a maintenance access to the tower, I hoped. As I ascended, the pressure became nearly unbearable. My nose, ears, and eyes began bleeding freely as I climbed higher. The staircase seemed to elongate impossibly with each turn, as if the tower itself was trying to prevent my ascent. I paused on a landing, gasping for breath, when I noticed markings etched into the stone wall, the same angular script from the bell, carved by some previous interloper who had made this journey before me. I traced the symbols with trembling fingers, and a fragment of understanding blossomed in my fractured mind. These weren't just decorative markings or mysterious runes. They were a musical notation system, instructions for producing a counter-frequency. The final flight of stairs brought me to a small maintenance platform just below the bell chamber itself. From here I could see the massive bronze monster in all its terrible glory, swinging in its cradle without the aid of rope or human hand. The metal gleamed with an oily iridescence that no natural bronze should possess, the strange symbols around its circumference pulsing with an inner light. Below, visible through gaps in the platform, the congregation had formed a circle around what remained of Thomas Hargrove, a contorted husk, his body bent backward at an impossible angle, his face frozen in a final scream as ethereal tendrils pulled at his essence, drawing it upward into the bell. And beyond Thomas, or rather, through him, I glimpsed something else. A suggestion of vast geometries and impossible architectures, a dimension folding in on itself, trying to pour through the aperture the bell had created. Within that non-space moved shapes that hurt my mind to perceive, entities composed of angles that couldn't exist in our reality, appendages that seemed to be reaching, grasping, eager to explore our world. The minister stood at the center of the congregation, arms raised, face ecstatic beneath his hood. "The boundary thins," he cried. "Our covenant is nearly fulfilled. I needed to act." The bell had no clapper. That had been removed decades ago as part of the town's deception. but traditional bells could be rung by striking the exterior with a hammer. I looked around desperately and found an old metal toolbox bolted to the wall. Inside was a rusted maintenance hammer, heavy enough to serve my purpose. Gripping the hammer in my blood-slick hand, I climbed the final few rungs to the bell chamber. Each movement was agony as the pressure crushed against my consciousness. The bell's swing had reached a frenzied pace, each arc bringing it precariously close to where I clung to the access ladder. The air around the bell shimmered with wrongness, reality itself becoming thin and permeable. As it swung toward me, I braced myself against the ladder and swung the hammer with all my remaining strength. The impact reverberated up my arm, nearly dislocating my shoulder. For one heart-stopping moment, nothing happened. Then, bong. The sound was deafening in the confined space, a pure, perfect tone that cut through the pressure in my skull like a blade. Below, the congregation screamed in unison, clutching their heads. The bell's swing faltered momentarily before resuming its arc. I struck again as it passed. Bong! The minister looked up, his hood falling back to reveal a face that was no longer entirely human. Features shifted and rearranged themselves continuously, as if multiple faces were trying to occupy the same space. "Stop them," he shrieked, his voice oscillating between octaves. Bong! A third strike. The rifts in reality began to tremble and contract. Whatever waited on the other side seemed to recoil from the sound. The congregants began to climb the walls like insects, their bodies contorting unnaturally as they scuttled upward toward my position. I had seconds at most before they reached me. Bong! 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 With each impact, the bell's strange markings dimmed. Cracks appeared in the bronze surface, spreading like lightning across its circumference. The entities beyond the rift began retreating, their alien appendages withdrawing as the doorway between worlds started to close. The first of the townsfolk reached the bell chamber, hands grasping for my ankles. I kicked free and struck the bell one final time. Bong! The sound hung in the air, pure and cleansing. The bell shuddered in its cradle, the cracks widening until, with a sound like 1,000 screaming voices, it shattered. Fragments of ancient bronze exploded outward, several pieces slicing through my clothing and into my flesh. The force threw me backward off the platform. I fell through darkness, expecting impact, death. Instead, I experienced a sensation of passage, as if I were moving sideways through reality rather than downward through space. I awoke in a hospital bed 3 days later in Austin, over 200 miles from Stillwater. According to the staff, I had been found unconscious by the highway, severely dehydrated and covered in lacerations that resembled shrapnel wounds. When asked how I'd gotten there, I had no explanation they would believe. The recovery was slow. The doctors found peculiar anomalies in my brain scans, subtle alterations in my auditory cortex that they attributed to trauma. My hearing was permanently damaged. Certain frequency ranges now caused me physical pain, while others, ranges inaudible to most humans, became perceptible as a kind of pressure rather than sound. When I was finally released, I found a package waiting at the hospital's front desk, a small parcel wrapped in brown paper with no return address. Inside was a single sheet of yellowed paper covered in those same angular symbols I'd seen on the bell, along with a note written in familiar shaky cursive, "Not all who hear the voice are its servants." Some of us have fought it for generations. The bell is broken, but fragments remain, and fragments can be reforged. Stay vigilant. Listen for the spaces between sounds. A friend that was 6 months ago. I haven't returned to Stillwater. News reports described a gas explosion at St. Matthias Church that killed 27 townspeople, including Sheriff Daniels and the church minister. The bell tower collapsed entirely. The town is rebuilding, donations pouring in from anonymous sources eager to see St. Matthias restored to its former glory. Sometimes in the deepest hours of the night, I wake to a familiar pressure building behind my ears. I tune an old radio to static and listen closely to the white noise, searching for patterns. Sometimes I think I hear voices whispering from the spaces between sounds, warnings, perhaps, or pleas for help. And sometimes, though I tell myself it's just my damaged hearing playing tricks, I swear I can hear the faint, distant tolling of a bell that should no longer exist. It calls to me. It knows my name. And one day I fear I will answer. You made it to the end of the stories. That means it's the perfect time to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And if you haven't already, leave a like and drop a comment. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Have a great time relaxing, and good night.